The sound was a flat, wet crack, an ugly punctuation mark in the murmur of the courtroom recess. It was sharper than a book falling, more personal than a gavel. For a full second, the noise hung in the thick, unmoving air of courtroom 12B, a space where the air conditioning had surrendered 2 summers ago and time itself had given up in 2019, according to the dead clock on the wall. Every head turned. Officer Daniel Rourke stood over the defense table, his hand still raised, palm slightly reddened. His face, usually a mask of practiced indifference, was twisted with a fleeting, raw fury. Before him, 15-year-old Lena Carter sat perfectly still in the scarred wooden chair. Her head had snapped to the side with the force of the blow. A single, bright bead of blood welled on her lower lip. The room froze. Lawyers, clerks, the bored-looking bailiff by the door, all became statues in a diorama of disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not in the open. The system's violence was meant to be quieter, a thing of paper and procedure, of plea bargains offered in sterile hallways and rights waved in a mumbled monotone. Lena slowly brought her head back to center. She did not raise a hand to her stinging cheek or her bleeding lip. Her eyes, a deep and steady brown, lifted to meet Officer Rourke's. They were not wide with fear or hot with anger. They were clear, focused, and unnervingly calm. She held his gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching until it was thin and brittle. Then, in a voice that was low but carried through the stunned room with perfect clarity, she said, "That was a mistake. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the simple certainty of a scientist noting a chemical reaction." And in the oppressive heat of the dilapidated courtroom, beneath the peeling paint and the gaze of a dozen complicit witnesses, the words landed with the chilling weight of prophecy. In the last row of the public gallery, a woman who looked like a slightly harried history teacher adjusted the plain, functional watch on her wrist. The movement was small, almost unconscious, but it angled the face of the watch just so, capturing the tableau at the defense table in pristine, high-definition video. The watch's microphone, sensitive enough to pick up the frantic beat of a hummingbird's wings, was having no trouble with the dead silence. Agent Claire Donovan felt her own pulse, a steady, measured rhythm against the frantic thrum of adrenaline. "Stay down, Rourke," she thought, her gaze fixed on the officer. "Don't let your lawyer pull you away. Give us 1 more second." 6 months. 6 months of living in a cramped apartment under a false name, of drinking bad coffee in courthouse cafeterias, of documenting the slow, grinding corruption of this place. It all came down to this. Today, her team, Rodriguez listening in a van parked a block away, Kim monitoring network traffic from a federal office downtown, had built a mountain of evidence. Wiretaps, financial records, surveillance footage. They had documented the conspiracy between ambitious prosecutors like Nathan Clark, who shielded police misconduct to secure convictions, and judges like Eleanor Graves, whose rulings showed a statistical bias against civil rights claims so profound it could not be accidental. But they needed a catalyst, an overt act, something so undeniable, so brazen, that it would shatter the veneer of plausible deniability. Rourke had just handed it to them. Claire's eyes shifted to the girl. Lena Carter. She had reviewed the file 100 times. 15 years old, honor roll student, no priors, lived with her grandmother. Claire had watched the shaky cell phone video of the arrest, the one Judge Graves would almost certainly refuse to admit, and had seen the same preternatural calm the girl was displaying now. It was the calm of someone who knew they were in the right, even when the world told them they were wrong. The courtroom doors opened, breaking the spell. A bailiff led Lena Carter in, her hands cuffed in front of her. The bruise on her lip from the initial arrest was fading to a sickly yellow-green, a stark contrast to the fresh, vivid red of the new cut. She walked with her shoulders back, her head held high. Her gaze swept the room, not in defiance but in assessment. She took in the bored bailiff, the preening prosecutor, the weary face of her own public defender. She was a defendant, a child in the eyes of the law, yet she moved through the space like an observer, cataloging the ecosystem of power that had ensnared her. Her eyes met Claire's for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition. Claire was just another face in the gallery. But in that fleeting glance, Claire saw something she hadn't expected. Not just resolve, but an intelligence that was actively processing, analyzing, waiting. The girl wasn't just enduring this, she was studying it. And Claire felt a sudden, fierce surge of protectiveness, an emotion that had no place in a federal investigation. This whole operation was about saving the system from itself. But right now, all that mattered was saving this girl. The memory of it was sharp, etched in the high-contrast light of a hot Tuesday afternoon. The air on 5th Street had been thick with the smell of bus exhaust and hot asphalt. Lena had just bought a carton of milk from Morrison's grocery for her grandmother. She was 30 feet away when she saw the old man. He was frail, with wispy white hair and the bewildered look of someone lost in their own neighborhood. He was shuffling, talking to himself, his hand patting the pockets of his worn cardigan. That's when Officer Rourke's patrol car had glided to the curb. "Sir, you need to move along," Rourke had said, his voice impatient. The old man, Harold Johnson, looked up, his eyes clouded with the fog of dementia. "My wife, Clara. She's waiting." "There's no one here, old man. You're blocking the sidewalk." Lena had stopped. Something in the officer's tone, a serrated edge of contempt, made the hairs on her arms prickle. She'd seen that tone before. She'd heard it in videos online, read about it in articles her grandmother, a veteran of the civil rights movement, would leave on the kitchen table. Harold Johnson fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a faded photograph. "Clara," he said, holding it out. "See?" Rourke slapped the photo from his hand. It fluttered to the grimy pavement. "I said move!" He shoved the old man, not hard, but with enough force to send the frail body stumbling backward. Harold's heel caught on a crack in the sidewalk. He went down with a sickeningly soft thud, his head striking the concrete. Without a conscious thought, Lena's phone was in her hand, the record button pressed. Her thumb was steady. She didn't move closer, didn't shout. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind from a conversation years ago. "If you see something, be a witness. A good witness doesn't become part of the story. They just tell it." She filmed as Rourke stared down at the unmoving form of Harold Johnson, his expression not of concern, but of pure annoyance. Then his eyes found her. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked, striding toward her. "I'm on a public sidewalk, officer," Lena said, her voice even. "I have the right to record." "You have the right to get that damn phone out of my face before I arrest you for obstruction." "You're not performing a police duty. You just assaulted an elderly man." She kept the phone steady, framing his face, his badge, the motionless figure of Harold Johnson on the ground behind him. Rourke's face darkened. He lunged, grabbing for the phone. Lena pulled it back, her grip firm. He twisted her arm behind her back, the sudden, searing pain making her gasp. The phone clattered to the sidewalk. He slammed her against the brick wall of the grocery store, the rough surface scraping her cheek. "You want to obstruct justice?" he snarled, wrenching her arms back for the cuffs. "Fine. Let's see how tough you are in a cell." As he pushed her toward his car, she saw paramedics arriving, a small crowd gathering. Her phone lay on the sidewalk, its screen dark. But she knew it had been enough. The video was on the cloud. The record was made. She had been a witness. "The people call Officer Daniel Rourke." Prosecutor Nathan Clark's voice was as smooth and polished as his Italian leather shoes. He stood before the jury box with an air of relaxed authority, a man entirely at home in this domain. Judge Eleanor Graves nodded from the bench, her expression stern. Judge Graves was known for two things: her unyielding, tough-on-crime stance and her remarkable ability to find procedural flaws in any case that alleged official misconduct. In the past 5 years, not a single civil rights complaint against an officer had made it past her courtroom. To Claire, watching from the back, she wasn't just a judge. She was a firewall. "Mr. Clark," the judge said, her voice raspy. "Proceed." Julia Perez, Lena's public defender, rose from her seat. She was young, barely 30, and the file for the People v. Carter was one of 23 active cases piled on her desk. She wore a suit that was slightly too big, as if she were playing dress-up in an adult's world. But her eyes, though shadowed with fatigue, burned with a fierce, idealistic light. "Your Honor," Clark began his opening statement, turning to the jury. "This is a simple case. It's about an officer attempting to render aid and a young woman who, for reasons of her own, decided to interfere. On the day in question, Officer Rourke was performing a welfare check on an elderly, disoriented gentleman, Mr. Harold Johnson. The defendant, Ms. Carter, began acting aggressively, shouting, and obstructing his efforts to help. Her actions created a dangerous situation, forcing the officer to place her under arrest to ensure public safety. It was a masterclass in narrative construction. Every word was chosen to reframe the truth. Welfare check, render aid, aggressively, obstructing. Claire silently ticked off the keywords she'd seen in dozens of Rourke's previous reports, a pattern of language designed to preemptively neutralize any accusations of wrongdoing. When it was her turn, Julia Perez's voice trembled slightly, but she stood her ground. "This case is not about obstruction," she said, her hands gripping the edge of the lectern. "It's about the First Amendment. It's about the right of every citizen to bear witness, to record the actions of public officials in public places." Lena Carter saw an officer use excessive force on a vulnerable man. She did what any of us would hope a brave citizen would do. She recorded it, and for that, she was arrested. The evidence will show that it was Officer Rourke who was aggressive. It was Officer Rourke who created the dangerous situation. And it was Lena Carter who was simply and bravely telling the story. It was a good opening, sincere, passionate. But Claire could see the jurors' faces. They looked at the decorated, uniformed officer, then at the quiet teenager with the bruised face at the defense table. And in their eyes, the story had already been written. The system's gravity was pulling everything toward its predetermined conclusion. Officer Daniel Rourke took the stand. He was the picture of composure, his uniform crisp, his posture ramrod straight. He recounted the events of that afternoon in a calm, professional monotone, a narrative honed by 12 years on the force and dozens of similar internal reviews. "I observed Mr. Johnson stumbling, clearly disoriented," he said, his eyes fixed on a point on the back wall. "He appeared to be a danger to himself, possibly about to wander into traffic on 5th Street. My primary concern was his safety." "And what happened when you approached him?" Clark asked, leading him gently through the story. "He became agitated. He wasn't making sense. He swung his hand at me, and I put my hands up to steady him. Unfortunately, he lost his balance and fell." A lie, Claire noted. Not a push, not a shove, a fall. He was steadying him. Plausible. And at this point, the defendant, Ms. Carter, intervened? "Yes. She came toward me, shouting. She had her phone up, right in my face. It was very aggressive. I ordered her multiple times to step back, to give the gentleman space so I could assess his injuries and call for an ambulance." Another lie. Lena had been 30 feet away, but it was his word against a 15-year-old's. "Did she comply?" "No, sir. She refused. She continued to shout, and a crowd was starting to form. The situation was escalating. She was preventing me from rendering aid. I had no choice but to take her into custody for obstruction. Clark nodded gravely. "Thank you, officer. Nothing further." From the back row, Claire watched the performance, her mind a cold, whirring machine of data correlation. "He's using the same script as in the Alvarez complaint from 2022, she thought, her fingers tapping a silent rhythm on her knee. Subject became agitated. I attempted to steady him, preventing me from rendering aid. It was a template, a linguistic shield. Julia Perez rose to cross-examine. "Officer Rourke, you said Mr. Johnson fell. Isn't it true that you shoved him?" "No, ma'am. As I stated, I was trying to steady him. And you claim my client was shouting. Can you recall what she said?" Rourke paused, a flicker of something, annoyance, uncertainty, in his eyes. "It was loud. A lot of anti-police rhetoric. I don't recall the exact words. So you, a trained officer, can't recall a single specific phrase she shouted, but you were certain it constituted a threat to public safety?" "The totality of the circumstances, ma'am," he began, falling back on the comfortable jargon of his profession. Julia pressed on, but it was like punching water. Rourke was too experienced, his story too rehearsed. He was the very picture of a reasonable man forced to act in a difficult situation. To the jury, he was an island of calm in a sea of chaos. To Claire, he was a predator who had perfected his camouflage. And the most dangerous part was that she suspected, on some level, he even believed his own lies. He had told the story so many times, about so many different people, that it had become his truth. The defense calls its first witness, or rather, its first piece of evidence, Julia Perez announced, her voice strained with a manufactured confidence. She held up a clear plastic evidence bag containing Lena's phone. "We would like to enter into evidence and play for the court the video recorded by Ms. Carter." Nathan Clark was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence. "Objection, Your Honor. Chain of custody and foundation." Judge Graves leaned forward, her expression sour. "Ms. Perez? Your Honor, the video was automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server at the moment of recording. We have a certified affidavit from the service provider confirming the timestamp and that the file has not been altered. It is the most direct piece of evidence we have." "An affidavit from a tech company?" Clark scoffed. "We have no way of knowing if the defendant altered the video before it was uploaded or if the angle is misleading. It's prejudicial." It was a flimsy argument, and everyone knew it. In any other courtroom, a judge would allow the video and let the jury decide its weight. But this was courtroom 12B. "The prosecution raises a valid point about the potential for digital manipulation," Judge Graves said, her voice a dry rasp. "And the angle of a video can indeed be highly misleading. The prejudicial effect could outweigh the probative value. Objection sustained. The video will be excluded." Julia stared, dumbfounded. "Your Honor, with all due respect, that video is the case. It shows exactly what happened." "I have ruled, Ms. Perez," the judge said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Do you wish to be held in contempt?" Julia's shoulders slumped. She retreated to the defense table, the air seeming to leak out of her. The weight of the system, of the paper, of the unwritten rules, was crushing her. Claire felt a pang of sympathy for the young lawyer. She was fighting honorably, but she had brought a legal brief to a back-alley brawl. She tried again. "The defense moves to introduce Officer Rourke's personnel file to establish a pattern of similar complaints." "Objection," Clark said, looking bored. "Fishing expedition. Irrelevant to the current charge." "Sustained," Graves snapped. "Motion to introduce testimony from 2 other citizens who filed complaints against Officer Rourke for excessive force in the last year." "Objection. Hearsay. Attempting to prejudice the jury." "Sustained." It went on like that for an hour. Every motion Julia made was blocked. Every attempt to introduce context, to show that this was not an isolated incident, but a predictable pattern of behavior, was shut down with a one-word ruling from the bench. It was a slow, methodical demolition of a defense. Lena Carter sat beside her lawyer, watching, her expression unreadable. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't crying. She was simply observing the systematic dismantling of her own story, as if she were a scientist watching a failed experiment, taking careful notes on what went wrong. The defense calls Lena Carter to the stand. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lena rose and walked to the witness box. She moved with a quiet composure that seemed to unnerve the room. She smoothed her simple gray dress, placed her hand on the worn Bible, and swore the oath in a clear, steady voice. Julia began gently. Lena, can you please tell the court, in your own words, what you saw on the afternoon of June 12th? Lena looked directly at the jury. She didn't look at Rourke. She didn't look at the judge. She spoke to them. Her testimony was a recitation of facts, delivered without embellishment or emotion. I saw Officer Rourke approach Mr. Harold Johnson. I heard him tell Mr. Johnson to move along. I saw Mr. Johnson try to show the officer a photograph. I saw the officer knock the photo from his hand. Then I saw him shove Mr. Johnson, who fell and hit his head on the sidewalk. Her voice never wavered. She was a human camera, replaying the footage stored in her memory. And what did you do then? I took out my phone and I started recording. Why? Because what he did was wrong. I thought there should be a record of it. It was a simple, devastatingly honest answer. Julia let it hang in the air for a moment before turning back to her table. Your witness, Mr. Clark. Nathan Clark approached the stand, a predatory smile playing on his lips. He saw an opportunity. He saw a teenager he could paint as a radical, a cop-hater with an agenda. Ms. Carter, he began, his tone dripping with condescension. You thought there should be a record. You're quite the activist, aren't you? I'm a citizen, Lena replied evenly. A citizen who runs a social media account where you frequently post articles critical of the police. Is that right? He held up a sheaf of papers. Posts with hashtags like police accountability and know your rights? Yes. So, you have a pre-existing bias against police officers, don't you? You went looking for trouble that day. Lena met his gaze without flinching. No, sir. I believe everyone should be held accountable for their actions. Police officers, politicians, myself, everyone. Clark shifted his approach, trying to trip her up on the details. How far away were you? About 30 feet. 30 feet? How could you possibly hear the entire conversation from that distance, over the city traffic? I didn't hear everything, Lena said calmly. I heard the officer's tone. It was angry. I saw what he did. I don't need to be 5 feet away to see a man shove an old man to the ground. Clark threw his hands up in theatrical frustration, but the move felt hollow. He had expected a nervous, emotional teenager. He had planned to provoke her into an outburst, to make her look unstable and unreliable. Instead, he was faced with an unblinking eye, a witness who refused to be anything other than what she was, a calm, credible observer. She had not only recorded the incident on her phone, she had recorded it in her mind, and she was playing it back for the jury with an unnerving, unshakable clarity. We'll take a 15-minute recess, Judge Graves announced, banging her gavel with unnecessary force. The tension in the room, wound tight during Lena's testimony, finally snapped. Lawyers stretched, jurors filed out, and the low hum of conversation returned. Lena remained at the defense table. Julia gave her shoulder a squeeze. You did great, Lena. You were incredible. Lena just nodded, her eyes tracking the movements in the courtroom. She watched as Nathan Clark conferred with Officer Rourke, their heads close together. Rourke's face was flushed, his jaw tight. He was angry. Lena's composure had gotten under his skin in a way no lawyer's questioning ever could. As Clark walked away, Rourke's eyes locked on Lena. He started toward the defense table, a slow, deliberate walk. The bailiff, who should have stopped him, suddenly found something interesting to look at on the ceiling. Julia took a half step forward, ready to intervene. Stay back, counselor, Rourke said, his voice a low growl. He stopped in front of Lena, leaning down, placing his knuckles on the table. He was so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he whispered, the words meant for her alone. "Little girl with her phone, trying to ruin a man's life. You need to learn your place." Lena looked up at him. She saw the tremor of rage in his hand, the tick in his jaw. She saw a man whose entire sense of identity was built on a foundation of unquestioned authority, and she was a crack in that foundation. "My place," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "is to tell the truth." That was when he snapped. The carefully constructed facade of the reasonable officer crumbled into dust. All the years of complaints, of unchecked aggression, of a system that looked the other way, culminated in this one reckless moment. He drew his hand back and slapped her. The sound, for the second time that day, silenced the room. The crack echoed off the peeling walls. Julia gasped, stumbling back. Blood, bright and shocking, welled again on Lena's lip. The room held its breath. The bailiff finally looked down from the ceiling, his face a mask of conflict and fear. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keys. Everyone saw it. No one moved. It was a moment of collective complicity, a silent agreement to pretend this wasn't happening. The cost of intervention was too high. The cost of silence, however, was a price they were all willing to let Lena Carter pay. But Lena wasn't looking at the bailiff or her lawyer or the stunned faces in the gallery. As she slowly brought her head back around, her gaze swept past Rourke, past the complicit silence, and settled on the back of the room. She found the eyes of the woman who looked like a history teacher. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. The woman in the back row stood up. Her movement was fluid, economical, and it cut through the room's paralysis. She walked down the center aisle, her sensible shoes making no sound on the worn linoleum. Every eye followed her. She did not look like a threat, but she moved with an unnerving purpose. When she reached the front of the court, she didn't stop at the bar. She walked right through it, stepping into the sanctified space reserved for officers of the court. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Graves demanded, her voice booming with outrage. "Bailiff, remove this woman!" The bailiff took a hesitant step forward, but the woman paid him no mind. She stopped directly in front of a still fuming Officer Rourke and a shocked Julia Perez. She reached into her jacket and produced a small leather wallet. She flipped it open. "Agent Claire Donovan, FBI," she said, her voice calm and authoritative, filling the space left by the judge's anger. "Officer Rourke, you're under arrest." Rourke stared at her, then laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You're kidding me, for what?" "For starters," Claire said, her eyes like chips of ice, "assault on a minor in a federal courthouse, but the warrant is a bit more comprehensive." As she spoke, the main courtroom doors swung open. Two more figures, a man and a woman in sharp, dark suits, entered, Agents Rodriguez and Kim. They moved with the same quiet efficiency, flanking Rourke before he had time to process what was happening. "The warrant cites conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and perjury," Claire continued, her voice never rising. Rodriguez expertly relieved Rourke of his sidearm, while Kim snapped a pair of gleaming federal handcuffs onto his wrists. The click of the cuffs was the loudest sound in the room. "This is an outrage!" Judge Graves thundered, rising to her feet. "You have no jurisdiction in my courtroom, Agent. I order you to release that officer and leave immediately." Claire turned to face the bench. She held up a thick, sealed document. "With all due respect, Judge Graves, this is now a federal matter. This warrant, signed by a federal magistrate an hour ago, authorizes us to take Officer Rourke into custody and to seize all relevant records from this courthouse, including yours." She took a step closer to the bench. "For the past 3 years, Your Honor, you have dismissed 100% of civil rights complaints filed against law enforcement officers that have come before you. The statistical probability of that happening without systemic bias is 0. We have the data, We have the emails. We have everything." Judge Graves's face went pale, the color draining from it until it was the same shade as the peeling paint on the walls behind her. Claire then turned her gaze to Nathan Clark, who was frozen by the prosecution table. "Mr. Clark, I'd advise you not to delete anything from your computer. You'll be receiving a federal subpoena within the hour." The established order of Courtroom 12B, a power structure that had seemed as solid and immovable as the building itself, had just been demolished in less than 2 minutes. While Agent Rodriguez led a shell-shocked Daniel Rourke out of the courtroom, Claire turned to the bailiff who was still standing by, looking utterly useless. "Unlock her," Claire said. It was a command, not a request. The bailiff fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking, and unlocked the handcuffs that had been binding Lana to her chair for the recess. The metal cuffs, which had been on her for hours, fell away with a soft clink. Lena rubbed her wrists, not looking at anyone, her focus entirely on the simple, private sensation of freedom. She stood up and began to gather her scattered belongings from the table: a worn paperback, a half-empty notebook, a pen. She moved with the same deliberate dignity she had shown all day. She was not triumphant. She was not relieved. She was simply herself. Claire approached her. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softer now. Lena finally looked up, dabbing her bleeding lip with the back of her hand. She met Claire's eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion showed in her own. Curiosity. "I knew someone was watching," Lena said. "I just didn't know who." "We've been watching for a long time," Claire admitted. "You were very brave. What you did today, it changed everything." Lena considered this for a moment, then looked at her own hands, now free. "He wanted me to fight back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "When he arrested me, and just now, he wanted me to scream or push him, to make it a fight." "Why didn't you?" Claire asked. "Because then it would have been about my temper," Lena replied, her gaze clear and direct. "I needed it to be about his." Claire felt a profound sense of awe. This 15-year-old girl possessed a strategic mind and a depth of courage that shamed every adult in the room. She had understood, on an instinctual level, that her power lay not in resistance, but in witness. She had made herself a mirror, and Daniel Rourke had shattered himself against his own reflection. "All charges against you have been dropped, effective immediately," Claire said. "You're free to go, Lena." Lena nodded. She slung her worn backpack over her shoulder. For the first time all day, she looked like what she was: a child at the end of a long, terrifying ordeal. But as she walked toward the courtroom doors, her back was straight, and she did not look back. The moment Lena pushed through the heavy doors of the courthouse, she was hit by a wall of light and noise. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes aimed at the sky like metallic sunflowers. Reporters surged forward, a chaotic swarm of microphones, cameras, and shouted questions. "Lena, can you tell us what happened? Is it true an FBI agent made an arrest in the courtroom? Ms. Carter, do you have a comment?" She flinched, instinctively shielding her face. After the suffocating quiet of the courthouse, the sensory assault was overwhelming. Her grandmother, who had been waiting anxiously on a bench, rushed forward, wrapping her in a fierce, protective hug. Julia Perez, her face a mixture of shock and dawning triumph, tried to form a barrier between Lena and the press. "No comment at this time," Julia said, her voice stronger now. "Please, give her some space." Through a gap in the crowd, Lena saw Claire Donovan emerge from the courthouse. She moved through the swarm with an effortless calm, deflecting questions with a polite but firm, "The U.S. Attorney's Office will be releasing a statement." The cameras turned to her, the new and more interesting story. It gave Lena and her grandmother the opening they needed. They slipped through the edge of the crowd and hurried down the street, the sounds of the media frenzy fading behind them. The impact was immediate and seismic. By the evening news, the story was leading every broadcast. Federal agents were seen carrying boxes of files out of the courthouse. The U.S. Attorney announced a sweeping investigation into the county's judicial system. A special master was appointed by a federal judge to take over Judge Graves's docket, effective immediately. The city council called an emergency session, suddenly finding the political will to approve a long-stalled proposal for a new, independent police oversight commission and mandatory, always-on body cameras for every officer. The machinery of power, so long rusted into place, was suddenly, violently, grinding into motion. Walking home, holding her grandmother's hand, Lena felt a strange sense of detachment from it all. The flashing lights and shouted headlines felt like they were about someone else. Her reality was the familiar cracks in the sidewalk, the comforting weight of her grandmother's hand, and the dull, persistent throb in her lip. She hadn't set out to change the system. She had just set out to tell the truth. It turned out sometimes they were the same thing. 3 weeks later, a small padded envelope arrived at Claire's office at the FBI field headquarters. It had no return address, but she recognized the neat, precise handwriting immediately. Inside was a handwritten letter on simple notebook paper, a folded newspaper clipping, and a small, worn photograph. Claire read the letter first. "Dear Agent Donovan, I hope this letter finds you well. My grandmother said I should write to thank you. What you did in that courtroom. Thank you. I wanted to give you an update. The newspaper clipping is about the federal probe. It's strange seeing my name in the paper. They keep calling me brave, but I don't feel brave. I just feel like I did what I had to do. The other thing is a picture of Mr. Harold Johnson with his wife, Clara. She passed away 5 years ago. I visited him in the recovery center last week. His son was there. He told me Mr. Johnson is doing much better. He still has good days and bad days, but he remembers my visit. He doesn't remember what happened, which I think is probably for the best. His son said to thank me. He said no one had ever stood up for his dad like that before. Things at school are a little weird. Some kids look at me differently. Some are asking me for advice, which is strange. I told them what my grandmother always told me. Just be a good witness. Julia Perez called me. She said she's starting a non-profit to help kids who get into trouble for filming the police. She asked if I wanted to be on the youth advisory board. I said yes. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About the law. I always thought it was this big, complicated thing for other people. But it's not. It's just rules for how we agree to live together. And sometimes people break the rules, even the people in charge of enforcing them. I think I want to be a lawyer. Not like Mr. Clark. Like Ms. Perez, or maybe like you. Sincerely, Lena Carter. Claire unfolded the newspaper clipping. It was an in-depth article about the ongoing corruption probe, with a small, grainy picture of Lena leaving the courthouse. Then she looked at the photograph of Harold and Clara Johnson. They were younger, smiling, standing under a blossom-filled tree. It was a picture of a life, a story, that had nearly been erased by a moment of casual cruelty. It was a different kind of evidence. Claire picked up her phone and dialed the number Lena had included at the bottom of the page. "Hello." Lena's voice was hesitant. "Lena, it's Claire Donovan." "Oh, hi. I got your letter," Claire said, a genuine warmth in her voice. "Thank you, especially for the picture. It helps to remember who this is all for." They talked for a few minutes, about school, about Julia's non-profit, about the law. "You said you wanted to be a lawyer," Claire said. "It's a hard job. It can wear you down." "I know," Lena said, "but I think it's important." "It is," Claire agreed. "And you have the most important quality already. People think law is about being smart or aggressive or clever. It's not. At its core, it's about courage. The courage to look at a thing and call it by its right name. You have that." A small silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Thank you, Agent Donovan. Call me Claire." The consequences, when they finally came, were swift and severe. The federal justice system, once engaged, moved with a grinding, inexorable force. Daniel Rourke, stripped of his badge and his pension, pleaded guilty to the federal charges to avoid a longer sentence on state charges of perjury and aggravated assault. The judge, a no-nonsense appointee from another district, sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison. During his sentencing, he remained impassive, a man who still seemed incapable of understanding the chain of events his own temper had set in motion. Judge Eleanor Graves did not go so quietly. She fought the charges brought by the Judicial Conduct Board, but the mountain of statistical evidence, combined with damning email records uncovered by the FBI, was insurmountable. She was stripped of her judgeship, and, in a subsequent action by the state bar, her license to practice law. She retired in disgrace. Nathan Clark, facing indictment for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, resigned from the district attorney's office. His promising career was over. He was eventually barred from practicing law and received 5 years probation for his role in systematically burying police misconduct complaints. The changes were not just personal, they were structural. As part of a consent decree with the Department of Justice, the county was forced to implement sweeping reforms. The new Permanent Civil Rights Monitoring Office, funded by the county but answerable to a federal court, was established. It had full subpoena power and unfettered access to personnel files and internal complaints. The era of the police department policing itself was over. The firewall that was courtroom 12B was gone, replaced by a transparent window. 18 months later, Lena Carter stood at a podium on her high school's football field, adjusting the microphone. She was the valedictorian. A light breeze fluttered the edges of her speech, but her hands were steady. She looked out at the sea of faces, her classmates, her teachers, her proud, beaming grandmother in the front row. In the back, near the bleachers, she saw a familiar face. Claire Donovan leaned against the fence, arms crossed, a small smile on her face. Lena began to speak. Her voice, the same one that had been so clear and steady in the courtroom, carried across the field. "We're told that silence is golden," she began. "We're told to keep our heads down, not to make waves, not to get involved. We're told that the world is a complicated place, and the best we can do is just take care of ourselves. But I've learned that silence has a cost. It's a debt that gets paid by the vulnerable, the elderly, the ones without a voice." She paused, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "My grandmother grew up in a time when bearing witness was a dangerous act. She and her friends marched and registered voters and spoke truth to power, and they paid a price for it. They taught their children, and my grandmother taught me, that we have a duty. Not just a right, but a duty to see what is happening in front of us and to not look away. The duty to witness. A year and a half ago, I saw something, and I was scared. But I knew that my fear was less important than the truth. I learned that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about deciding that something else is more important than your fear. Justice is more important. Truth is more important. Our shared humanity is more important. So, as we leave here today, to go on to college or jobs or whatever comes next, I hope we remember that. Don't look away. Don't be silent. Be a witness. The world doesn't change with grand gestures and loud declarations. It changes with small, steady acts of truth. It changes when good people decide that the cost of silence is simply too high to pay. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then the applause began. It started at the front and rolled backward, growing into a wave of sound, a 5-minute standing ovation that was less for her grades and more for her character. From the back of the field, Claire watched as Lena was enveloped by her family, her grandmother's hand on her cheek. She saw the pride, the love, the resilience that had been forged through generations of struggle and quiet defiance. She thought about the case, the files, the warrants, the press conferences. The system had, in the end, worked. Justice, or something resembling it, had been served. But it hadn't been the system that started it. The system was inert, self-preserving, resistant to change. It hadn't been the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office that had provided the spark. It had been a 15-year-old girl with a cell phone and a deeply ingrained sense of right and wrong. A girl who had the quiet courage to stand on a public sidewalk and refuse to look away. That, Claire knew, was how real change always began. Not in the marbled halls of justice, but on the cracked pavement of a city street. Not with the stroke of a pen on a sweeping piece of legislation, but with the press of a button on a small rectangular screen. It happened one person at a time, one moment at a time, with one small, steady act of truth. And in a world groaning under the weight of its own injustice, that quiet courage was the most powerful force there was. Lena's story is a powerful reminder that the courage of one person can ripple outward, challenging injustice and inspiring profound change. It shows that you don't need a badge or a law degree to make a difference. Sometimes all you need is a steady hand and the conviction to bear witness. Her journey from a quiet observer to a catalyst for reform highlights the immense power of truth in a world that often prefers comfortable silence. If this story of quiet courage and accountability resonated with you, please help us share it. Like this video to show your support, subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter, and share it with others who believe in the power of a single voice. Your engagement helps these important narratives reach a wider audience. Thank you for watching.